The wind swept dry across the dusty Texas pasture as the sky hung heavy with clouds. A quiet tension settled over the old auction yard. 12-year-old Annie Sue Briarwood stood still, clutching the worn hem of her skirt. Her eyes locked on the golden palomino horse just a few feet away, Shiloh, the horse she'd raised, loved, and whispered her heart to ever since Mama passed. Beside her stood her father, Colt Renshaw, his broad frame weighed down by more than just the years. His flannel shirt smelled faintly of whiskey, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he counted the folded bills. Across from him, Bo Ashburn, a stern rancher with a cold gaze, held out a burlap sack marked with a green dollar sign. He gripped Shiloh's lead rope without emotion. Annie Sue couldn't speak. Her throat burned, her chest ached, but the words wouldn't come. She'd begged her father not to sell Shiloh, cried until her voice cracked, pleaded until her knees gave out. But Colt, numbed by grief and years of drinking, only said, "Love don't pay bills, sweetheart." Shiloh tossed his head, sensing something was wrong. His golden mane whipped in the wind, and his eyes searched for Annie Sue's. She stepped forward without thinking, burying her face in his neck, her tears soaking into his warm coat. "Please don't go," she whispered, arms wrapped tight around him. "Please, boy." Colt looked away. Even in his haze, that moment pierced something deep. But not enough. "Money's fair," Bo said flatly. Colt nodded. The bag of cash exchanged hands. Just like that, it was done. Bo turned to lead Shiloh away, but the horse didn't move. He dug in his hooves, refusing to leave Annie Sue's side. The crowd fell silent as Shiloh let out a long, echoing cry. It wasn't just a whinny, it was heartbreak in the air. Annie Sue sobbed harder, her small hand still gripping a piece of the lead rope that had come loose. A final thread between them. No one spoke. In the distance, the clouds began to break, but the heaviness lingered. And just like that, the world Annie Sue knew, the one with Mama's memory in every blade of grass and Shiloh's gentle nuzzle at sunrise, crumbled. But what neither Colt, Bo, nor even Annie Sue could know was that this goodbye wasn't the end. What happened after would change everything. The house was too quiet that evening, the kind of silence that seeps into the walls and presses on your chest. Annie Sue sat on the wooden steps of the porch, knees pulled to her chest, still wearing the same dusty boots from the auction yard. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tears, and her hands trembled around the frayed piece of rope she had refused to let go of, the last thing Shiloh had touched before he was taken away. Inside the house, Colt Renshaw lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, the flame flickering against the shadows that clung to the kitchen. He didn't speak, didn't even look at Annie Sue as he passed by the window. He'd said what needed to be said hours ago, and he'd convinced himself she'd be fine by morning. She was a tough kid, just like her mother had been. At least, that's what he told himself between long, bitter swigs from the bottle hidden behind the flour jar. But Annie Sue wasn't fine. Every part of her ached in a way she didn't have words for. The kind of ache that didn't come from scraped knees or bad dreams, but from a wound deep in her chest, something that felt permanent. She couldn't stop replaying the moment Shiloh turned his head to look back at her. It was like he knew. Like he didn't want to leave either. That memory burned sharper than any goodbye she'd ever known. Her fingers tightened around the rope. Later that night, as the moon rose full and low over the field, Willa Jean Winslow, the elderly neighbor from down the road, knocked gently on the door. She didn't need to ask what had happened. Word spread fast in towns like this. She just brought a warm dish of cornbread and a soft voice. "I heard," she said softly to Colt, who didn't meet her eyes. "She's not eaten. Not speakin' either." Willa's voice trembled, heavy with concern. "She lost more than just a horse today." Colt didn't answer, but after a pause, he walked out onto the porch. Annie Sue didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead into the dark, the rope wrapped tightly around her wrist now like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. He stood there beside her for a long while, both of them quiet. He opened his mouth once to say something, anything, but nothing came out. What could he say? Sorry didn't feel big enough. That night, Annie Sue couldn't sleep. Her dreams were full of hoofbeats and dust and Mama's voice calling from somewhere she couldn't reach. And when she finally opened her eyes just before dawn, there was only one thought in her mind, clear as the sunrise creeping in through the cracks of her window. She had to get Shiloh back. The morning light crept slowly across the floorboards of Annie Sue's bedroom, but she didn't move. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, her pillow still damp from the night. When the first bird sang outside her window, something in her chest stirred, not hope exactly, but determination. She had spent the entire night replaying every detail in her head, and now there was only one thought that mattered. Shiloh wasn't gone. Not really. Not if she could find a way to bring him back. She crept down the stairs, careful not to wake her father, who was passed out in his old recliner with the bottle still balanced on his lap. His boots were muddy, his hat slumped beside him, and his snores filled the silence with a low, broken rhythm. Annie Sue slipped past him and stepped out onto the porch, the morning breeze cool against her face. She still held the rope in her hand, a constant reminder of what she'd lost, and what she was willing to fight for. She didn't have a plan yet, not really. But she had an idea of where Bo Ashburn's ranch was. Folks around town knew his place, just past the edge of Miller's Creek, near the old cotton mill ruins. It would be a long walk, maybe even impossible for someone her age. But that didn't matter. She couldn't sit still, not knowing Shiloh was somewhere out there, alone, scared, maybe tied to a fence with strangers who didn't understand him. The thought made her heart pound harder. She was going to get him back. Somehow. By mid-morning, she was sitting at the counter in Willa Jean Winslow's general store, pretending to browse through a catalog while sneaking glances at the hand-drawn map on the bulletin board. Willa, sharp as ever, didn't miss the signs. "You thinkin' about runnin' off somewhere, sugar?" she asked, leaning on the counter with that knowing look she always wore. Annie Sue hesitated, then nodded. Willa sighed, reaching for a paper bag. "Then you best not go empty-handed." She filled it with biscuits, jerky, and a canteen of water, sliding it across without another word. Outside, Annie Sue's feet moved faster than her thoughts. The dirt road stretched out in front of her like a challenge, and with every step, she felt the weight of her choice pressing on her back, but so did something else. Something like fire. She was scared, yes. But for the first time since the auction, she wasn't crying. She was doing something. Even if it was foolish, even if she didn't know how it would end. Back at home, Colt Renshaw stirred awake to an empty porch and the distant echo of a screen door creaking shut. He rubbed his face, noticing the rope was missing from the table. Something sank in his gut. A fear he hadn't felt in years. And deep down, he knew, Annie Sue was gone. The sun climbed higher as Annie Sue followed the narrow country road that curved between fields of dead grass and rusted fence lines. Her boots were already worn through, pebbles digging into her soles with every step. The paper bag from Willa Jean bounced against her side, and sweat clung to the back of her neck. She'd never walked this far before, not alone, but every mile brought her closer to Shiloh, and that was all that mattered. Her breath was shallow, but her will was steady. She imagined what it would be like when she saw him again. Maybe he'd hear her voice and break free from the corral, galloping toward her like in the stories Mama used to read. Maybe he'd remember her scent, her laugh, her promise never to leave him. That promise still echoed in her mind, haunting her, a vow broken not by her hand, but by her father's. And that betrayal burned deeper than the Texas sun on her skin. She kept walking. Back at the Briarwood ranch, Colt Renshaw stood frozen on the porch, one hand gripping the post like it might hold him up. The house was silent, no creak of floorboards, no sound of humming or footsteps. Just emptiness. He saw the old lead rope was gone, and on the table beside it, a folded napkin with Annie Sue's shaky handwriting. "I had to try. I'll be okay. A.S." His heart pounded. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the note, his breath caught in his chest. Then he turned sharply, grabbed his keys, and ran to the truck. As the engine sputtered to life, Jedediah Hollister, the town preacher, spotted Colt from the church steps. He raised a hand to wave but stopped when he saw the look in Colt's eyes, something close to panic. Jedediah stepped off the porch and flagged him down. "She's gone after the horse, ain't she?" he asked, voice low. Colt didn't answer, just nodded once before speeding off down the road in a cloud of dust. Jedediah watched him disappear, whispering a quiet prayer under his breath. Meanwhile, Annie Sue was crossing the edge of Miller's Creek, her legs aching, her lips cracked from the heat. She stopped to rest beneath a pecan tree, pulling out the water Willa Jean had packed. As she sipped, a pickup truck passed on the gravel road above. She ducked quickly, heart pounding, not knowing it was Bo Ashburn himself heading into town. Her timing, like fate itself, was just a breath behind. She didn't know how far Bo's ranch still was. She didn't even know what she'd do when she got there. But she knew this much: she wasn't turning back. Somewhere past those hills, her heart was waiting. 4 hooves, golden mane, and eyes that still knew her soul. By the time Annie Sue reached the edge of Bo Ashburn's property, the sun had begun to dip low, casting long shadows across the dry pastureland. Her legs felt like lead, and her throat was raw from the dust and heat. She stood behind a cluster of trees, staring at the wide-open corral just beyond the fence. Her heart skipped a beat. There he was. Shiloh. His golden coat shimmered in the light, and he stood near the far end of the pen, still as a statue, his head low. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around his neck and never let go, but she knew better than to make a scene on someone else's land. Especially Bo Ashburn's. She crouched in the tall grass and watched quietly, her fingers gripping the old rope like a lifeline. Shiloh lifted his head slowly, ears twitching, eyes scanning. For a moment, it felt like he saw her, not just noticed, but recognized her. She held her breath. Then he took one slow step toward the fence, then another. Annie Sue felt tears sting her eyes, but she stayed put, afraid that even one wrong move would break the fragile magic of the moment. The connection between them, though strained by distance and time, was still there. Still alive. Inside the ranch house, Magnolia Prescott, Bo's 16-year-old daughter, watched from the upstairs window. She'd seen the girl come out of the woods and crouch by the fence, and at first she assumed it was a trespasser. But then she saw how the horse reacted. Calm, alert, focused, and something about the scene tugged at her heart. She knew that horse didn't act like that for just anyone. Magnolia had a quiet strength, a deep well of observation. She sensed this wasn't just a runaway kid. This was someone who had lost something and wasn't ready to give it up. Downstairs, Bo was fixing a wire on the back fence when he noticed hoofbeats shifting in the front corral. Shiloh was moving, but not randomly. He was pacing, ears perked, as if drawn toward something. Bo narrowed his eyes and scanned the tree line. That's when he saw her. A small figure kneeling in the tall grass, dusty, sunburned, and clearly exhausted. But even from this distance, he saw the rope in her hands. Recognition hit like a stone. "Damn," he muttered, pulling off his gloves. Annie Sue didn't run when Bo approached. She stood, wobbling slightly, but steady. Her face was flushed, her clothes clung to her from sweat and travel, but her eyes were clear. Determined. "Please," she said before he could speak. "I know he's yours now. But he's mine too. He's part of me." Bo didn't answer right away. He looked at the horse, then at the girl. Something shifted in his eyes, not weakness, but memory. Of his own daughter. of a time he almost forgot how to feel. He sighed, heavy and slow. And then he said, "Come inside. We need to talk." The inside of Bo Ashburn's house smelled of leather, dust, and wood polish, the scent of a life built with calloused hands and silence. Annie Sue sat at the edge of a faded armchair, her shoulders tense, fingers still wrapped around the frayed rope. Shiloh grazed calmly just outside the window, unaware of the storm unfolding inside. Bo leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed, not angry, but searching. Trying to understand the girl who had walked miles through Texas heat just to stare into a horse's eyes. Across the room, Magnolia Prescott lingered in the doorway, quiet as ever. She'd brought Annie Sue a glass of water and a cool cloth, but she hadn't asked questions. She didn't need to. Magnolia had seen enough hurt in her own house to recognize the look in Annie's eyes, the kind that comes from promises broken by people you love. She gave Annie a faint, encouraging nod before slipping out again, giving her father space to do what she knew he struggled with. Feel. "I bought that horse fair," Bo finally said, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. "Your daddy brought him up here with a handshake and a price." Annie Sue nodded slowly. "I know," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But he didn't just sell a horse. He sold the only piece of my mama I had left." That hit harder than Bo expected. He looked down, running a hand over his weathered face. "I didn't know," he muttered. "Your mama?" Annie nodded again. "She's gone. 2 years now." Bo sat down across from her, letting out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for decades. "You know," he said slowly, "your daddy and I used to ride in the same rodeo circuit. Long time ago." Annie Sue's eyes widened. "You knew my daddy?" Bo nodded. "Before the drink got hold of him. He was one of the best bronc riders I ever saw. But grief changes a man. I learned that the hard way too." He didn't say it, but Annie could feel it. He wasn't just talking about Colt. He was talking about himself. Outside, the wind picked up, and Shiloh lifted his head, ears flicking toward the house. The light from the window caught his coat just right, and Bo watched the way Annie looked at him, like she was looking at her whole world. "He still knows you," Bo said. "That horse, he hasn't let anyone near him. Not since he got here." Annie smiled faintly, the first real smile since the auction. "He's waiting for me." Bo stood slowly and walked to the window. "You can spend the night in the guest room," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure something out. But I ain't letting you walk that road home alone. And I reckon there's a conversation I need to have with your father." The next morning, the air hung heavy with humidity and the scent of rain not yet fallen. Colt Renshaw's truck rolled slowly down the gravel drive of Bo Ashburn's ranch, tires crunching with the kind of weight that came from more than just rubber and rock. Colt hadn't slept. He'd spent the night staring at Annie Sue's empty bed, haunted by memories of her mother's laugh, her hands, her voice. And now, guilt wrapped around his chest like barbed wire. He wasn't sure what he'd find when he stepped out of the truck, or if his daughter would even look him in the eye. Bo was waiting near the gate, arms folded, stance firm. The kind of man who didn't speak unless it mattered. Colt got out, nodding stiffly. "She here?" he asked. Bo didn't answer at first. He just looked at him, the kind of look that cut straight through the years of distance between them. "She's inside. Safe. But shaken," he said finally. "You let her walk 13 miles through open country for a damn horse." Colt's jaw tensed. "It ain't just a horse to her," Bo added, quieter. "And you know that." Inside, Annie Sue stood at the window, peeking through the curtain. Her stomach twisted at the sight of her father. Part of her wanted to run out and fall into his arms, the way she used to when she was little. But that part had been buried beneath layers of hurt. She didn't know who that man was anymore, and she didn't know if she could trust him again. Still, she waited, unmoving, as the screen door creaked and Colt's boots echoed through the hall. When Colt stepped into the living room, his eyes found hers instantly. She looked older somehow, not by years, but by weight. Life had carved something into her that shouldn't be there yet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost afraid. Annie Sue nodded once. "I'm not hurt," she said. "Just tired." There was a pause, thick and heavy between them. Colt shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean for it to go like that," he muttered. I thought I was doing what I had to." Annie Sue looked down. "You didn't ask what I needed." Bo stayed nearby but didn't interrupt. He understood some things had to be said between blood. Colt stepped forward, then stopped. "I ain't proud of what I've become, Annie Sue," he said, voice cracking. "But I'm trying. I swear to God I'm trying. Your mama, she always believed I had more in me. I just don't know if I do anymore." Annie Sue blinked back tears. For a long moment, neither Colt Renshaw nor Annie Sue spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things neither had the courage to say out loud. Finally, Colt took off his hat, crushing it in his calloused hands. "Your mama, she believed in both of us," he said, his voice thick. "And I've done nothing but disappoint her memory." He looked at his daughter with eyes worn by years of hard living and harder regrets. "But I ain't lettin' you walk away thinkin' I don't care. 'Cause I do, Annie Sue. I care more than I know how to show." Annie Sue wanted to believe him, wanted to feel that little girl trust again, the kind she used to carry like a warm blanket. But trust wasn't something you handed back like a borrowed coat. It had to be earned. She stood there, rope still in hand, as the weight of her choices pressed in. "I didn't run because I hate you," she whispered. "I ran because I didn't think you'd come after me." The pain in her words landed harder than any slap. Colt flinched and then nodded slowly. "I deserved that." In the kitchen, Magnolia Prescott stood with her back against the wall, listening quietly. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something about this family, this fracture, felt familiar. Her own father, Bo Ashburn, hadn't always been present either. She knew how silence could cut deeper than any word. Part of her hoped that if Annie Sue and Colt could find their way back to each other, maybe she and her father could too. Maybe hurt didn't have to be permanent. Back outside, Shiloh stood calm in the corral, as if he too felt the shift happening inside the house. Bo leaned against the fence, watching the horse and the family inside with a complicated look in his eyes. He'd seen men break bones and spirits in the rodeo, but nothing broke a man like losing his family. Colt was a stubborn fool, but Bo remembered the version of him that used to laugh, used to love. Maybe there was still a piece of that man left. Maybe Annie Sue was the only one who could pull it back out. Annie Sue turned toward the window, looking at Shiloh, then back at her father. "If you really mean what you said," she whispered, "then prove it." Colt raised his eyes. "How?" She swallowed hard. "Start over. Get help. Stop drinking. Talk to me like I matter." Her voice cracked. "Just try." The room felt still, heavy with choice. Colt nodded slowly. "All right. I'll try." But as Bo stepped back onto the porch, a truck pulled into the driveway. Not Colt's, not Bo's. A stranger. Dust rolled behind it, and the doors didn't open. Something was coming. And none of them were ready. The truck rumbled to a stop in front of Bo Ashburn's ranch, its engine idling like a low growl. The dust it kicked up hadn't even settled before both front doors swung open. Two men stepped out. One wore a sweat-stained ball cap and mirrored sunglasses. The other had a clipboard in his hand and a badge clipped to his belt. The taller of the two eyed the house with suspicion. "Colt Renshaw live here?" he asked Bo, who had stepped forward, arms crossed, his body blocking the front porch. Bo didn't flinch. "He's a guest," he said flatly. "This is my property. What's this about?" The man with the clipboard adjusted his belt and cleared his throat. "Animal welfare complaint. Came in anonymous. Said a horse was sold under questionable conditions and a minor may be involved in some kind of domestic situation." Bo's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this was. Someone from town, probably a nosy passerby, had seen Annie Sue on the road alone and decided to get involved. The timing couldn't have been worse. Inside the house, Annie Sue froze at the sound of strange voices. She peeked through the curtain and saw the uniform, the badge, the stranger's stern expression. Her heart jumped. Colt cursed under his breath. "I knew this would come back to bite me," he muttered. He started toward the door, but Annie Sue grabbed his arm. "Don't run," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not really. You're trying now. That's what matters." Her words landed with surprising force. For once, he didn't reach for the bottle. He reached for her hand. Bo stepped aside as the men approached the porch. Colt met them on the steps, hat in hand, eyes steady. "My daughter's here with me. She wasn't taken, she wasn't hurt, and no law was broken. I made some bad choices, but I'm fixin' them." The officer raised an eyebrow. "We still need to ask her some questions. Alone." Bo didn't like it, but he nodded. Annie Sue stepped outside, chin lifted despite the fear in her eyes. "I came here on my own," she said firmly. "To get my horse back. My daddy didn't force me. He just didn't stop me." Her voice cracked at the end, but her meaning was clear. The officers exchanged a look, then backed off slightly. "We'll file the report. But it sounds like what this family needs ain't a courtroom, it's a second chance." With that, they climbed back into their truck and drove off, leaving only the fading sound of tires on gravel and the weight of what almost happened. Annie Sue exhaled slowly, her hand still wrapped around Colt's. That night, as the stars blinked awake one by one, Shiloh stood beside the fence, quiet and steady. Annie Sue leaned against him, whispering promises again, not just to him, but to herself. One more sunrise, and everything could change. The sun rose over Bo Ashburn's ranch like a quiet blessing, soft, golden, and slow. The air was cool and clean, the kind that carried the scent of grass and new beginnings. Annie Sue stood by the fence with Shiloh, brushing his coat with long, gentle strokes. He leaned into her touch like he always had, breathing in rhythm with her. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt still. Not because things were perfect, but because they were finally honest. Inside, Colt Renshaw packed the last of their things into the back of his truck. He hadn't touched a bottle in 3 days, the longest stretch in years. It wasn't easy, nothing about this road would be, but it was a start. He'd made a quiet promise to himself as he watched his daughter sleep the night before. He wouldn't lose her too. Not the way he'd lost her mother. If there was still something left to salvage, he was going to fight for it. Not with words. With action. Before they left, Bo came out onto the porch with Magnolia, who handed Annie Sue a small, folded note. "It's just my address," she said shyly. "In case you want to write or visit." Annie smiled, heart swelling. They weren't best friends. Not yet, but something had started between them. A quiet understanding built on shared hurt and silent strength. Annie hugged her quickly, then turned to Bo. "Thank you for listening, and for letting me see him again." Bo gave a slow nod. "You gave me more than you know, kid." As the truck rumbled to life, Shiloh's trailer secured behind them, Annie Sue leaned out the window one last time, waving at the people who'd seen her, really seen her, when she felt invisible. The dirt road stretched out ahead like a question, but this time, it didn't scare her. Colt glanced at her in the rearview mirror and cleared his throat. "When we get back," he said carefully, "I was thinkin' maybe I could fix up the old barn. Make it right for Shiloh. For you." Annie Sue turned to him, eyes wide. "Really?" He nodded. "One board at a time." Back at the Briarwood Ranch, the land looked the same. Cracked earth, sagging porch, and fields thirsty for rain. But to Annie Sue, it felt different. Shiloh stepped off the trailer and paused, sniffing the air, then trotted toward the pasture like he knew he was home. Annie ran after him, laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. Colt watched from the porch, arms crossed, tears in his eyes. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't need to be explained. And as the wind swept across the grass and carried the sound of hooves and hope through the valley, Annie Sue whispered to herself, "We're gonna be okay. Not perfect, not fixed, but finally okay."